Shalom. This talk is going to be in English, so I hope you enjoy. It's a pleasure to be here in Israel, my first time with Dr. Leshem. I've explored much of the country, but just the beginning. What I want to share with you today is a story that is about saving birds. In some ways, it parallels a lot of what I heard about the swifts, people recognizing a problem, coming up with a clever solution, and ultimately making a difference. So I'm going to talk about puffins first. It's a bird that I don't think has ever appeared here in Israel, but it's a bird that tells us a lot about its habitat, and it's a species that I've worked with for 42 years, bringing them back to the state of Maine, where they disappeared. They disappeared because people hunted them for feathers, along with other kinds of birds. There was a time in the United States when people hunted bird to decorate their hats. It was a complete slaughter of most species. It was a terrible time for birds. Everything from tiny little hummingbirds to egrets to puffins ended up on hats. That led to the loss of many species. And then in 1969, I started visiting the Maine coast, and that's when I learned about puffins. Now, a puffin is an ocean bird that comes to land just for the purpose of nesting. They are upright, penguin-like birds. This one has a gulf feather in his beak, not a common thing, but occasionally they play with feathers. They eat small fish, and they come to land just for the purpose of nesting. That was about all that was known, except that they had disappeared from Maine for almost 100 years. Since 1969, I've worked on methods to bring them back, and we've set up a series of field stations, the red spots in this photo, and these are places where I now have projects working on, but I want to share with you one spot called Eastern Egg Rock. That is where this story started in 1973. Eastern Egg Rock is a small 7-acre island. It is washed over, much of it, in the wintertime. There's not a tree growing on it. Big boulders around the edge. That's where the puffins nested, but they've been gone for almost 100 years when I started the project. Now, when I started this work, most people thought, why would you want to do that, bother to bring the puffin back? It was not an endangered species. In fact, millions of them still existed. And I said, well, if we could learn how to bring the bird back to this one little island, we could use that methods for other rare species in other parts of the world who were endangered. At that point, the general idea was that no one bothered with trying to save species unless it was a game bird, a bird that one would hunt. The general idea was that if you tampered with nature, you were playing God, and that wasn't really something that was up for people to do. Let nature take its course. And I want to come back to that point later because I've thought about that quite a bit. Now, a puffin starts out life like this. This is a 10-day-old puffin chick. At this point, puffins have just one chick. It lives underground. The parents take turns raising it, and when it's about 6 weeks old, it comes out and heads off to sea by itself, not without the parents. I began this idea with the notion that if we were to move young puffins at this age from a large colony in Canada and we were to bring them to Maine, perhaps they would learn that Maine was their home and they would not go back to Canada about 1,000 miles away where there were still large colonies. So we managed to get permits to collect puffin chicks. It took 13 government permits to move those first chicks over the border from Canada to the United States, which is a little odd when you think that they fly over the border without any permits at all. But these are protected species now. The days of hunting them for food and feathers are long gone, but now is a time to try to help them. So with a briefcase full of permits and boxes full of puffin chicks, we collected puffins in Newfoundland, Canada, brought them back to Maine. The first ones, in 1973, and here I am, as a young biologist, putting the first puffin chick into a hole in the ground. It was rather like planting a garden, putting a seed in the ground and waiting to see what would come up. We put fish in the hole with the puffin chick, and it would eat the fish. But unlike a gardener, where you can watch and see whether the plant grows and flourishes, a puffin is a very different kind of crop, because you feed them, then they head off to sea and they disappear. We didn't know it, but they disappear for 3 years before they come back. So there's a gap between the time that you start gardening for puffins and when you can hope to have a crop. And meanwhile, I had people saying, why bother to do this? Let nature take its course. And I had to say, be patient. It will be worth it. But let's watch and see. We invented every method along the way because no one had ever tried to restore a colony of any kind of seabird before this. The birds were taken out of the case, they were put in the hole, they were fed fish. And then when they were about a month old, the puffin chicks came out, they looked around, we banded them, and they headed off to sea for the first time, in the dark. And then we waited. Now, along the way, we had to wait and see what would happen. 5 years went by without seeing anything coming back. Until finally I decided, if we don't see something very soon, no one's going to help pay any more money to run this project. You can imagine trying to ask your supporters to help you continue this work. Keep saying, be patient, be persistent. This is important. I began worrying that maybe the puffins would come back, but maybe they wouldn't feel at home. There were no other puffins there. They live in colonies. And so I came up with the idea of putting out decoys, a technique that is used widely to attract birds to hunting range, but never before used to attract birds to a breeding place. And so we put up some decoys, and on a rock where I had 3 decoys, imagine my amazement when I looked out and there were then 4. This happened the day I put up the decoys. So puffins apparently were looking at the island, but they were missing others of their kind. And I discovered at that moment a pretty exciting thing, is that the social cue of other birds was very strong, and it limited whether they were there or not. I couldn't see any puffins around with my eyes, but the puffins were so keen-eyed they could see each other at miles apparently away. I also experimented with putting up boxes with mirrors on them because puffins are very social birds. They did learn that the decoys were fake. They're not stupid. But they weren't so quickly figured out what a mirror was all about, because when they look at their own face in a mirror and it moves, then they thought they stayed tighter with the mirrors. And the combination of mirrors and decoys looked promising. Yet still, 8 years into this project, I was still telling the supporters of this work, be patient. We've got some back, but there was no nesting. Would they nest? Would this eventually, what would happen? So 8 years into the project, I was getting more puffins coming back. They were landing with the decoys, flying in, flying out, but no puffins were nesting. Until 8 years into the project, I eventually saw a puffin come winging in with his beak stuffed full of fish. And the only reason a puffin would bring fish back to its colony was if there was a chick. In fact, underground in the burrow, the puffin flew in, came out without the fish, which meant that some of these puffins, and they were banded, they were the chicks that I brought from Newfoundland, and they had proved that this general idea of translocating chicks, learning a new home, attracting them with decoys, would eventually prove successful. The puffins at Eastern Egg Rock took 8 years to recolonize that little rock. The colony stayed small at only about 15 pairs for about 15 years, but in recent years the population has been growing rapidly, and with exception of a couple of years where the water was warmer than usual, which is something we're worried about now, but they took a couple years off, they rested, and they came back stronger than ever. And last summer we had 148 pairs breeding, And this is very exciting because it shows that you can bring back a species where it had disappeared. But you have to be patient, you have to be persistent, and you've got to have friends that believe in what you're doing. We've replicated this project on a different island called Seal Island National Wildlife Refuge, a little further up the coast. Same story, people hunted the puffin for food and feathers, they disappeared. We did the same thing. Again, it took another 8 years. This is not a project for impatient people. 8 years from when we moved the first puffin chicks to the first few pairs in 1992. Look at the scale of this growth in the hundreds of pairs. Over 500 pairs now breed on this island. And again, we demonstrated that with patience and persistence, these puffins will come back. We've used these methods for other species as well, and I want to share some of the other examples of how you can adapt this general idea to help other birds. These are birds more similar to those you'd see here in Israel. They're terns. Terns are small gulls. And they nest on the ground, and they feed their little ones, little fish. And they are famous for being long-distance migrants. We've done some tracking as well, and this is a little geolocator tag on its leg. These are Arctic terns. These are the longest distance migrants in the world. Just to show you where we do our work off the Maine coast and where these puffins go, these are tracks for 5 different terns, all fly out to the mid-Atlantic Ocean before they cross the equator and scatter down here, some to Argentina, some to Africa, some up here into the Indian Ocean. They all reconvene on the ice packs of Antarctica before they take a beeline back up to Maine. They spend most of their year on the wing. Well, what do you do for a bird like this that's also been hunted for food and feathers? Well, we adapted our techniques. We couldn't move the baby terns because the parents migrate with them. And so we put out decoys, and for the first time we started using audio recordings, that is, recordings of the courtship calls of Arctic terns. Discovered some interesting things with these terns. The male terns are very fond of decoys, and they'll offer fish, being very hopeful that if that decoy were to accept the fish, that would be the beginning of a relationship that might last for decades. These are long-lived birds. Not too bright, you might think, but then in their world there are no such things as decoys. Sometimes we've seen mating behaviors like this one with the decoys. Even a stylized decoy is enough to fool a amorous Arctic tern trying to find a mate, but eventually they'll pick a more receptive mate, and the pair will start nesting, and new colonies will start, often inches away. This is a method that is really probably one of the most interesting management techniques we've come up with yet. It's been used all over the world. It's called social attraction, and putting out decoys, playing recordings, invariably leads to attraction. And with attracting the Arctic terns, we began attracting roseate terns as well. And to the critics of our project, here we could say that here we are finally helping an endangered species. These roseate terns only breed among common terns. If you can attract the common terns, you can attract roseate terns. But an irony of all this work is that the more success you have, sometimes the harder it becomes. We've attracted thousands of terns to certain islands, but all those terns produces a lot of guano, a lot of excrement, fertilizer, that makes the weeds grow so rampantly that it actually crowds out the terns. So what do? You've gone all of this trouble to bring the terns back, and now that they are ruining the habitat for themselves. Well, we keep inventing new methods to try to stay ahead of this process, and one of the methods is to put down large outdoor carpets, and the outdoor carpets then create little islands. The terns are nesting successfully among this. And so far we've managed to bring them back. They live in artificial boxes, much as your swifts do. And as long as we are out there managing this habitat, I think we're going to keep these birds there. These techniques have now used worldwide. There are at least 14 countries with at least 50 species of seabirds that have benefited, and this map shows some of the locations. This work started in the United States, so we have the most projects. And slowly it has spread to other parts of the world. I'd love to get a spot on the map here in Israel, so let's think about what we can do. But Australia, New Zealand, these methods are very helpful because there's lots of seabirds endangered there. In Mexico, we have some projects as well that we're working on. I want to just show you a few of these projects and what's involved with them. Huge obstacles. These are common murres nesting onto a rock, a sea stack off of California. And this is what it looked like before an oil spill killed almost all those murres back in 1983. Now, how do you put decoys up on top of a rock like this with big sea stacks? You have to hire mountain climbers. And there are people that love to climb up those kinds of cliffs, and they like jump off of fast-moving boats, climb up the cliffs, carry up the decoys. We have done this 400 decoys up on top of that rock with car batteries running sound systems and photovoltaic panels. It's remarkable, but it's work. Here's the mirrors, those are decoys, and here's the real thing, nesting with the decoys. Now the colony has increased. Here it is before the oil spill, 1979. Now, here's what it looks like in 2012. These are not decoys, this is the real thing. Using these decoys, it took about 6 years to get a colony rebuilt, but now it's going strong, and we're not doing anything out there. So that's a good example. Here's another exciting project with the short-tailed albatross of Japan. Short-tailed albatross used to be about 6 million of them until people in Japan killed most of them to fill mattresses. The survivors nest on only one island called Torishima Island. But you can tell from the shape of it, this is an active volcano. It could blow any day. It could make headlines, and if it happens, the few hundred pairs that are left there could be killed. So in Japan, there's a project, several projects now, using decoys and audio recordings. These are very lifelike decoys the Japanese have built, complete with nostrils and feathers and legs with scales, and the best in Sony sound systems to attract these albatross. They blare these out to sea, and it's working. It's amazing. And they're also helicoptering off some of the chicks off the volcano to a non-volcanic island, hand-feeding the birds. Here's a project that we're just starting in China. This is the rarest seabird in the world. It is the Chinese crested tern. There's only 50 of these birds left. The problem with these Chinese crested terns is that people in China are taking their eggs and eating them. And the Chinese, however, are now using the same methodology. These are decoys, and these are a couple of Chinese biologists, solar panels going up, and they have succeeded in attracting the greater crested tern, which is a large number of birds, but among them, last summer they attracted all 50 of the endangered Chinese crested terns into a sanctuary where they can be protected. And here is a close-up view of a couple of the Chinese crested terns with the decoys. And this is a very hopeful project for this rare species. This is one of the better examples that I can point to the critics who challenged my work when we first started, saying, why bother to save the puffin? There's so many puffins. But now we're hoping the methods are being helpful for the rarest seabirds in the world. Now, attracting birds back to islands is not enough. You have to educate people, I believe. As you are here in Israel with so many clever projects to engage a larger and larger numbers of people, because if people don't care about all this, it doesn't matter. The biologists can't save these species at the end of the day. Live streaming cameras are a great way to do it. Last year we had about 8 million visitors to our live puffin cams and to our live osprey cams. Educating people at Audubon's Hog Island. I hope someday some of you will come to visit. Last year I had the pleasure of working with Yossi on Hog Island, teaching a course about raptors. It's a magnificent spot off the Maine coast that I have the privilege of being the director of. We educate people about birds here. What a great thing to do. 6 days on this island paradise. But how long are we going to have to hire those interns to sit out on the islands? When do these projects end? It's a common question. I hear it all the time. I've heard it for 40 years. When do these things end? Sometimes with the MER project, it seems to have some sort of an end, but often it doesn't. We have to have interns on the islands because the predators can't read. No matter how many languages we were to put here, the gulls and the eagles now can't read, and they will displace the birds. A couple of years ago, I thought I'd outsmart the birds by putting a robot out there. This is the robot. This is one of my interns. We dressed them alike. They both had rifles. The intern shot at gulls every now and then to scare them off. The robot didn't. The birds learned quickly. They're much smarter. Never underestimate a bird. Their faces don't move like ours do with expressions, but they're thinking all the time, and they recognize individual people. So what do? We're training whole new generations every year. These are 20 young interns that I put out on the islands off the Maine coast. They are the stewards of these islands. They are the faces that the predators see and learn to stay away from. But they're also the people that sit in bird blinds observing carefully the lives of birds. They're seeing the oceans change. The oceans are warming. The fish species are changing, dangling out of the beaks of the puffins. How many fish does it take to raise a baby puffin? We learned last year that it took 2,500 little fish to raise one puffin chick. If the seas are not healthy enough to support puffins, they won't be healthy enough to support people either. And it's the same story around the world. The health of the oceans is the health of the planet. We're seeing the kinds of fish change. Some fish are responding to good fisheries management. In the US, our haddock and our redfish populations are on the increase, but we're also seeing southern fish like this big butterfish move up, too big for the baby puffins to swallow, and chicks starve when they eat that one. So the future of these birds is really in our hands. Everywhere we need people that care. Not just people to sit out on islands and protect the birds, but people to support conservation with good, solid contributions of dollars and cents and vote in ways that favor healthy environments. Seabirds need our help. About a third of the species of seabirds in the world are now globally threatened. They live on islands. They're affected not just by the oceans, by what happens on the land and the air. But people can make a difference. Thank you.